I have a purchased copy of Fortnite. Now I know what you might be saying, Edrem, what are you talking about? This is meant to be a Final Fantasy XIV video. And also, why did you purchase Fortnite? It's a free-to-play game. But I reply to that of, I purchased Fortnite back when it was good. Back when Fortnite was a paid-for game, before it was a battle royale, it was a PvE base-building defense game against waves of zombies, and that was the better version of the game. Now I say this because when I give criticism of Fortnite and where it's headed, no one should listen to me on my opinions, because my opinion would not be good for the actual game, right? We can all clearly see that. The Battle Royale mode in Fortnite has been an amazing success for that game. But it's also not the game that I like anymore. And this is one of the things that I've seen pop up a little bit more now with 14, but also with some other games, is that there's a lot of people in the community who are like, hey, I've been playing this game for a long time. Like, oh, I remember playing this game a long time ago. I'm not happy with these changes. I want them to be better or so on. And all that I have to say is that's not a good base to start from. It's tangential to giving constructive criticism, but I see a lot of people rely on that. And all I say is don't rely on it. Sometimes changing your audience, in the case of what Epic Games did with Fortnite, works massively. So let's get into it. Let's get into the main crux of this, right? Because I have seen a lot of criticism of games, 14 in particular, but obviously there's a lot of other stuff coming out. Monster Hunter Wilds comes to mind at the moment, that's getting a lot of flack for things. And I want to kind of talk about some of the pitfalls that I see and some of the stuff that can immediately be pointed out to people of like, hey, you need to change how you word this, or word it better, or think more about how you want to give feedback. There's a lot of people that do just rant online who are not expecting people to actually pick up whatever they say. But for the people that actually want the developers to take what they say and implement fixes for things, this is for them. This is how do you give better constructive feedback to people? This is me telling people, hey, your constructive feedback is not good enough. Let me give you constructive feedback on how to do better constructive feedback. So there we go. And the first thing we're going to get to, and the biggest one that I see, is feedback needs to be actionable. Now, this is kind of one of those corporate terms that I don't really like, but it's kind of good in this situation. It's also success metrics and things like that, and deliverables. But basically what this means is your feedback needs to be something that can actually be measured in terms of success or failure. So, for example, with 14, there's been a lot of people that want 3 ultimates per expansion, right? That is an actionable metric. If we get 3 ultimates this expansion, we can turn around and go, oh, they took that feedback onto account. Good job, good job, devs. Good job. Something that is not actionable but has been absolutely screamed at by a lot of people since Endwalker is we want more mid-core content. And for starters, I could do a whole video on how mid-core is meaningless because everyone disagrees on what it actually means. But secondly, more is not a good quantity. If I said someone, hey, you need to add more to this recipe, how much is more? What is more? If they add one more bit of mid-core content to an expansion, is that enough in people's eyes? If they add one new, if they start adding another dungeon in, maybe every second patch, would that be enough for people? It's probably not. You want to set some actual targets for things, because otherwise you've got developers who are there just in the dark. They don't know what they need to change. They know that people are unhappy with things, but they're but what do we actually do to make people happy? Because they're not telling us. And a good example of this right now is we had we had Chaotic come out, and developers described that as mid-core content. And a lot of people weren't happy because to them, that's not what mid-core is. It's more mid-core content in Dawn Trail from the developer's point of view. But a lot of people don't consider that to be mid-core, so they're angry, but their feedback wasn't heard. But in a way, their feedback was heard. The other one that I've seen that is one of the worst things you can ever say is they need to innovate. They need to change things up. They need to do any of these things. These absolutely, completely arbitrary metrics of, like, what does that mean? What does innovate mean? Right? Like, was Island Sanctuary not innovative? Kind of was. Wasn't really successful in most people's eyes, but it was innovative. Changed things. But that's not often people mean. So it's one of those things where I want people to be better about defining things. I want people to be better about, like, saying, hey, you know, here's an actual target for developers to do. If a developer reaches this, congratulations, you know, successful. They don't, well, then that's a failure. But these kind of like wishy-washy targets of they just need to do this, or I want more of this, but not specifying what. It's really not good. People should try and think more on what they want to define. Second one, and this is what my channel kind of started out of, is be reasonable. There's a lot of people who want this game to be something that's completely not. And again, like, I bring up my example with Fortnite, where I am not being reasonable when I say I want the game to be more PvE building defense, right? I'm not being reasonable there. I know that. That's why my criticism is not good. But you've got a lot of people who just want either them to completely change what this game is, or you want them to add things that are just way too much for what the game is. I've got kind of a video that I'm making on this, which is, oh, the puppet has stopped working. Great, mid-recording. There we go. I've got a kind of video that I'm working on this for the actual amount of content that we're getting per patch, because we are getting more content per patch. That's a whole nother video. But people are requesting a lot more, right? They're always requesting a lot more things. They're always requesting way more things, not realizing either like how much development time this stuff takes, or the other big one is they want a feature to be out and they want it to be good, and they don't want the game to ever release bad things, even though in the last example, like, innovating and trying out new things means that they might release something bad, right? You can't know if something's good when you've never released it before. So there's stuff like that. Be reasonable is one of those, unfortunately, it's not quite actionable. It's kind of one of those wishy-washy targets of, I want people to be better about this. Another small one I've seen is, like, for example, the Crossworld Party Finder. When I first started hearing talk about that, I said that it would probably be estimated 1.5 years to develop. That was my estimate, just on how I know 14 is kind of done. Then Yoshi came out at a Media Fest interview. He said about 3 years to develop. And I'm like, you know what? That's probably fair. He's got a better understanding of the system, and I'm famous for underestimating how long projects take. So that's kind of reasonable. Yeah. That's not necessarily a spaghetti code thing. You should watch my other video on that, by the way, spaghetti code. But it's just a huge amount of work to change the entire architecture of the game. And it's one of those things where people just, if you're not in programming, you're not in game dev, you're not in a area that doesn't deal with that, you might not actually know how much work some of these things can take. It can be a huge amount of work. So yeah, be reasonable. And lastly, and this is the hardest one, but this has also helped me so much in life for everything. Use devil's advocate. Help if I could spell that. Use the devil's advocate. I've gotten in trouble for doing this with people in the past, but the devil's advocate basically is when you argue against a point, not for the sake that you disagree with that point, but just to try and find flaws in your argument. Right? So an example of this is, I would argue against something that I'm going to present online to try and one up people who would already like argue against me and bring up points. A good example of this is there was a lot of people that were complaining about Bitcoin now and cryptocurrencies and NFTs. Now, I don't like them. But I do know that one of the arguments that people use, that they use an excessive amount of power, doesn't apply to all the cryptocurrencies and wouldn't apply to Ethereum soon. But people still posted that, right? They still use that as one of the arguments. So I was like being devil's advocate there, being like, you shouldn't use this argument because it's not that strong. It's kind of weak and it's becoming weaker. Here's better reasons why crypto coins are shit. You know, that kind of thing. But this does mean, like, yeah, trying to find holes in your own criticism, trying to find holes in what you suggest that would make them weak. One that I see a lot of people need to do, and I see a lot of discussion around it where people are attacking it, is the tombstone cap each week. The 450 tombstone cap. Now, I have ideas of how to improve it, but all of the improvements never actually changed that the maximum you can get per week is 450. Because there is a huge amount of things that changes with the game once you change that. The other one I see a lot of is, for example, like unlocking the Savage tier, right? When you unlock the Savage tier, that means you can get gear for every single time you clear. You're not locked out at the end of the week. So you're not locked out for the week and then you reset at the end of the week. Once the lockout happens, people go and farm the tier as much as they want. They get all the gear they want. And then after that week, Party Finder for the raid dies. Because everyone that has gotten the gear doesn't need to do it anymore. And people who haven't gotten the gear, well, they're just out of luck. There's probably not enough people in Party Finder anymore for them to easily find groups. And that's kind of my argument of like why they take so long to unlock the raid tier is they want a certain amount of population to make it through the entire raid tier because they know once they unlock it, they can't lock it again. And once they unlock it, like learning parties are dead. Most of PF is dead. There's a tiny bit of activity, but it's nowhere near as strong. So that's one of those things where I see a lot of people argue for this of like they need to do this and they need to do this, but they're not thinking about the knock-on effects. One thing that we have in the game now, right, is that a lot of people wanted the ability to travel across data centers. But that has created unintentionally the knock-on effect of Dynamis feels dead, right? Because everyone in Dynamis feels the compulsion, the urge to travel over to Ether to raid, even though if everyone stayed on Dynamis, you'd probably have enough people to actually raid on Dynamis. And it's like, that's not technically the game's fault. That's kind of the game's fault and the community's fault because people, if they just stayed on Dynamis, they'd be okay. But they're using a feature to benefit themselves the most, which means that everyone needs to also now use that feature to benefit themselves. So there's stuff like that. Anyway, it's just a relatively quick video that I wanted to get out because I see a lot of these points not being done and I would like people to do better with their arguments in the future. Not specifically at anyone, but I kind of want people to think about this more. Whenever you're trying to argue a point in the game or like argue for like something kind of feature that you want, try and think about these three things. I think MMOs, more than other games, get this kind of community over time. And I think about this with Monster Hunter because... For example, the new Monster Hunter is kind of maligned for being a lot easier than it used to be. And some of the ways that you interact with it being a lot easier than it used to be. But for the people who still like the old system, the old game is there. It's still there. It's still playable. They can still go and do it and have fun. In MMOs, we don't have that, right? Many of the people who really enjoyed Stormblood's systems can't do that anymore because Stormblood's systems are gone. That's the nature of an MMO, is everyone is always on the same version. So there is a lot more of this over time with MMOs where you get this community of constantly wanting to be like this or like this or like this, right? Because you can't really have different versions all within the same game. But yeah. Anyway, that's my little video on how to do better criticism. Thank you all for watching. I'll be live over on Twitch every Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday. All right, goodbye.